Hello again. I'm Matthew Roche again, and I'm happy to welcome you all for this new panel of Identity 2024 to talk about a very important topic, the other side of identity, the privacy side. We can't talk about identity without talking about privacy. Data protection is core to everything we're doing as an industry, but also obviously everything we're doing in the identity space. And so today I'm really happy to have a great panel of experts to talk about data protection and identity. And I will let you guys introduce yourself. Do you want to start, Lisa?
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Lisa Abousaleh, CEO and co-founder of Neutronian.
Linda?
Hi everyone, my name is Linda Thielová. I'm the head of Privacy Center of Excellence and a global DPO for OneTrust.
Arielle?
My name's Arielle Garcia. I am the founder of ASG Solutions. Prior to that, I was Chief Privacy Officer at Worldwide.
And Tony?
Hi, I'm Tony Katsur. I'm the CEO of the IID Tech Lab.
Great. I'm really excited about the discussion. We have kind of a really great panel of experts on the topic here, and really covering every kind of angle, every sides of the topic. Let's start with you, Tony, quickly to take us through like what the landscape looks like today from a data protection standpoint, and from your venture point, right, with the Tech Lab, you're having a global lens. So what does it look like today?
What the landscape looks like today, I'll say in one word, is fragmented, or in two words, highly fragmented.
I was expecting a different word, but that's very politically correct.
Yes, there are different words we've used in the past to describe it. The global privacy landscape remains fragmented, what I would also call frothy in the form of there's a lot of activity, and there's going to be, I think, a lot of activity for at least the next 5 to 10 years. I think privacy, solving for identity, solving for new forms of addressability in a privacy by design manner is going to be the issue of our industry's time, I think, for easily 5 to 10 years. If you look at the landscape today, there are 5 US state laws that are now enforceable on the books. There are 4 that are enforceable. Utah goes into effect next month in the United States. GDPR, remains very vibrant and very much alive in the EU. You have various stages of enforcement for the Digital Services Act, also in the European market. The Brazilian market has created their own form of a data protection authority. Canada has its own form of a data protection authority. They also have some fragmentation in the Canadian market, with the Quebec law being somewhat unique to the federal Canadian law. Indian Parliament just passed their first privacy framework. They're still fleshing out the details of that law. And I think we'll know what that looks like over the next 6 months as the regulators within the Indian government get together and start to detail that. You've got the beginnings of a data protection framework in the Australian market. There are bills on the floor of Japanese Parliament. There are roughly anywhere between 5 to 8 new U.S. state privacy laws that are going to hit the books next year. There are several that are confirmed: Texas, Montana, Oregon. There are probably 3 to 4 more on the heels of that will likely be enforceable at some point in 2024, probably 5 more on top of that in 2025. I'm only scratching the surface. So that just gives you a sense. When I call it fragmented or highly fragmented and frothy, meaning there's a ton of activity, those would be the 2 terms I would use to describe the state of privacy in our industry.
So that sounds scary. Are there common grounds, common kind of angles, common principles? Maybe Arielle, do you have a view on this? Like, are they all very different, or are we talking about one and the same thing, and it's just like applied through different regulations in different territories?
Sure. So this is going to be an oversimplification, but by and large, we can think about GDPR as largely an opt-in regime, and the US is still in an opt-out kind of regime, or opt-out of sale. That, again, it's an oversimplification, but there are also other common themes that we're seeing, even though I would say like Europe and to some extent now the US, because of the FTC, have been the most proactive around special category data or sensitive data, but we can expect some of those themes to be common across the board. The way that I like to think about this, especially when we think about global brands, is it's helpful to understand those macro themes. Like if we know that sensitive data is going to be subject to increasing restriction in an increasing amount of markets, and that the impetus for that is really consumer harm and mitigating consumer harm, then it would be a good step to take to be proactive about issues like that. Whereas other issues, like for example, opt out of sales, a very specific concept, and you need technology and infrastructure to be able to implement as required by prescriptive regulation, as well as to enable those macro level policies, like how you're going to treat sensitive data.
Yeah, because for brands who operate in different countries, like that must be a nightmare, a headache at least, let's say, right? And you've worked with a lot of brands at UM before. How do they? Is it top of mind for them? Are they aware of all those things, or?
Yeah, so I think that brands generally have varying degrees of comprehension, right? So when you most often talk to these brands, they see the headlines, right? They understand CCPA, they understand there's a patchwork in the US, they know GDPR has been around. What they're not following necessarily as closely, which is why it's something that I talk about most frequently, is arguably, I would say, the FTC and the CFPB in the US have taken the most kind of transformative steps to enforcement and rulemaking that easily gets missed from the radar of advertisers. But in terms of how they approach, I've seen kind of a split. Like there's some appetite for trying to find the I guess the greatest common factor and applying that across the board to the extent possible. There are other scenarios where they really want to take a more fine-tuned jurisdiction-specific approach. So for example, where a big portion of the US still doesn't have a state privacy law, like the argument would be from a commercial perspective, it would be less disruptive to only implement where they have to. My personal perspective is, again, the US is an opt-out regime. So it probably is not juice may not be worth the squeeze, but the importance of having infrastructure and technology and a consent management platform that can support all of that is critical nonetheless.
That's a good transition to go to you, Linda. Consent management platform. I mean, historically, very much kind of publisher driven, right? And has it been like? Have you seen a scaled adoption as regulation kind of come into force? Publishers going to step up and start to implement CMPs, or is it been more a kind of a global move towards adopting technology to kind of handle data protection requests from users?
Definitely, I would say there's points to both. In my view, I think, and just to echo Arielle's point, I think a lot of this is driven from like the GDPR-esque trend. So I feel like a lot of businesses, even though they might not necessarily be based out of the EU, are marketing towards EU-based users, and they kind of fall in with the trend, and GDPR is kind of like pushing forward the trend of, you know, having your trackers in good order, being able to present the right options to the users and kind of act on the whole guidance from regulators, which to Tony's point is still not always totally aligned. So I think that's definitely been one bit that has driven a lot of interest from the advertiser space, as well as basic users, smaller businesses, just trying to make sure that they're getting into the right spot and the right shape. But I think overall we're kind of seeing that there is a bit of a best practice emerging, at least from my perspective. I've definitely seen that there are some expectations around like what you need to be presenting as a business on your website, and it feeds into your brand and kind of like the bigger messaging you're putting forward. So I think that is like the additional push, which might not necessarily be legal or driven by one specific thing, but it's more like the environment has evolved to a point where you're expected to have these things.
Yeah, I was going to say it's becoming a consumer expectation almost.
Absolutely.
And would you say like on the sell side of the market, right? Publisher, media owners, like we're pretty much done. It's covered. It's like everybody's up to the level of standard we need to, and then we have to do work on the brand side. Is that a fair kind of assessment, or is there still work to do on the publisher side as well?
I feel like given the fact that the regulatory environment is constantly evolving, I would never say that we're like done and dusted on the publisher side ever. I think it's more about also innovating and figuring out how to do things we're doing with maybe like less friction on the user side, and also figuring out how we can also come forward with like a more harmonious way of doing things across the global spectrum. So I think that's one bit that is definitely appealing, and I think that's like a very fitting theme. Like the standardization piece is definitely something I'm hearing a lot of asks for among the customers, for sure.
I'll put a pin into the user expectation and the user experience, because I think that's a really important topic to talk about. But if just to kind of close the cycle, we've talked about brands, publishers. Lisa, you talk to a lot of ad tech and data companies who are kind of operating in this space, and you help them kind of understand practices and or evaluate kind of best practices. What's your assessment of the level of readiness of the market, of the good thing, the bad things that are being done? Where do you think we are right now? It's always, I mean, it's been like what, 5 years into GDPR, but only a few months or a few years into most of the American kind of regulation. So how quickly, how fast are we moving, and how close to the finish line are we, do you say? Would you say?
I think there's a wide spectrum of readiness depending on, where folks sit in the ecosystem. For better or for worse, you will see folks that have already gotten slapped on the hand. The big, tech companies, the platforms, a lot of times you'll see they are the most buttoned up or have the most policies in place and are addressing the disclosures. But I think that there's still a lot of work to be done, especially with smaller players, especially even, when we go through and do an assessment of data privacy, we're looking not only at platforms, but also publishers, data providers, and brands themselves. So kind of having that full spectrum. And I think it differs by category, but then also within the categories, depending on, some of the things that my fellow panelists have said, whether it's a business that originated, from the EU and has been more established, or, a US-based business. I think there's also the challenge with the patchwork approach in the US. A lot of times what we're seeing is that even though there are additional state laws outside of CCPA, the first US law to go into effect, there are many companies that are still limiting individuals' rights to just those that live in California. And what I mean by that is you go to a website, you see the, do not sell my data option, you click on it, and there's a drop down. And if you select any state outside of California, it basically says you can't complete your request, right? And so I think there's a game of catch up that companies are playing right now, where that's, very nearsighted, and it needs to be a longer term perspective and thinking, okay, how do we keep up with this, or even better yet, how do we get ahead of it?
Get ahead, yeah.
Global principles that we can abide by.
I mean, have you seen companies using this as actually a sales argument, a competitive advantage? Is this something that, or are we still trying to play catch up, as you say, in most cases?
There are companies, yes. I think it is a differentiator, and now is the time. So for anyone that is more buttoned up, is more forward thinking, I think it is a way for them to differentiate themselves and to point out, we've thought through all of the steps here. We're ahead of our competitors, and therefore less risky for you to work with, because we're already prepared. So I do think there are some folks that are doing the right things and forward thinking when it comes to this.
It kind of echoes what the point, Arielle, you were making earlier about the relationship, the value exchange, right? The communication with consumers, right? If it's part of that value proposition, part of it becomes more natural than just like, hey, we need to slap you, like, we slap that pop up in the middle of your consumer experience. So it feels like a logical evolution, right? Like kind of playing catch up for some point, but then getting ahead of the trend and trying to kind of turn that discussion to your advantage. There's a clear, I think there's a wide spectrum of situations, geographical, but also in terms of advancement, in terms of like adoption. How are we adopting? How are we thinking about standardizing and obviously standardizing tools? So maybe Tony, can you what is your approach at the Tech Lab with like the kind of the organization of the industry role that the Tech Lab has? What do you think we need to do and to do more of to come to a more standardized, more kind of unified way of doing things?
Well, you can standardize on technology, like protocols and signaling frameworks. You can standardize on. One thing you can't standardize on is policy, right? Policy is going to vary by jurisdiction, but the technology can harmonize policy across jurisdictions. And so that's what the Tech Lab is focused on. How do we introduce technical frameworks that can harmonize policy across multiple jurisdictions? And what does it mean to harmonize policy? Well, to Arielle's point, GDPR is very much an opt-in regime. The U.S. states are very much an opt-out regime. Well, there's different levels, there's different forms of consent that have to be offered in those jurisdictions, whether it be the state of California versus the state of Utah versus the entire European economic zone. Frameworks like the Global Privacy Platform that we've developed are intended to harmonize that level of signaling, right? You can create a TCF string using the Global Privacy Platform, and you can also create a California state string or a US national string or a Canadian TCF string or even a Quebec form of consent signaling. So the technology frameworks are designed to harmonize policy across jurisdictions. It's still up to your local IABs or trade organizations that you work with to interpret what public policy is and inform against best practices of complying with those policies. So if you look at what the IABs are doing, IAB Europe in Europe and other regional IABs across Europe, IAB Australia, IAB Brazil, IAB Canada, and IAB US, they're interpreting policy on behalf of the industry. Tech Lab's role is to then harmonize and synthesize the interpretation of those policies so you can have clear technical signaling to ensure that the consumer's preferences were honored and that you are in compliance with local law. So that's how we approach it. It all started with the TCF. Yep. And the TCF has now advanced to TCF 2.2. And then as privacy became much more of a global concern, Europe clearly has been leading here for a while. That's why we created something like the Global Privacy Platform to create this synthesized policy framework, this technical policy framework for the industry.
Because there is enough commonalities in the different regulations right now that we can harmonize, right? We don't have to do like the split to kind of bridge between whatever Australia and Brazil, right? There's enough common principles, transparency, control, right? Whether it's opt-in or opt-out, but like it's standardizable in a way with the Global Privacy Platform.
Yeah, you can certainly streamline compliance across jurisdictions using something like the Global Privacy Platform, correct?
And so the Global Privacy Platform, the aim is obviously to kind of roll this out. Can you tell us more about is there like a calendar? Is there a time frame? Is it for everyone in the industry, brands, publishers, everyone in the middle? What's the angle here?
Yes, brands, publishers, ad tech, everyone that is part of the digital advertising ecosystem can use the Global Privacy Platform. It can create TCF strings for European compliance. It can create, the robust number of US state strings that are only going to increase over the course of 2024. It can support TCF strings in other jurisdictions as well. And we're monitoring developments in other regions. So, as I mentioned earlier, Indian Parliament passed new data protection regulations that they're going to be fleshing out over the course of, I would guess, the next 6 to 9 months. Once we understand and can interpret those, what that policy is, we can then manifest that in the form of a string. So as long as proper notices and consent is given to the consumer and they then opt in, we can then mint a string against that consumer to ensure that they have either opted in or in other cases opted out of sharing their data with not just the publisher partner, but also throughout the entire supply chain. As we all know, and all of your listeners or viewers know, there are myriad partners that go into making the industry sausage, so to speak. So the GPP is intended to transcend all constituents, all partners across all regions. It's been out for about a year, and it is gaining adoption is accelerating across the ecosystem. Most of your major CMPs have adopted it and do support it. And then many of the ad tech companies are now in various stages of deployment or completed their deployment. And now I know a wide swath of publishers are also in the midst of deploying or have completed their deployment as well.
So we've got the kind of the technical infrastructure to be able to support kind of a various privacy regulation requirements in a more streamlined manner. But let's talk about the consumer experience for a minute. Let's talk about users and how we kind of interact with users. What's your, but let's start with you, Linda. What's your role, and how do you kind of handle or advise your clients into kind of making, being a part of that discussion? Because you're a part of that discussion now de facto, right? When the first time you go to a website in Europe, you have that interface, and in more and more countries, in more jurisdiction, you're going to have that type of discussion first, like, hey, are you cool with this, right? Can we enter into this value exchange? So how do you help them navigate this?
No, that's a definitely good point here. I think from our perspective, the CMP tool, the way we offer it to our business customers, we want to make sure that part of that offering is also facilitating a lot of the key decisions that you need to make as a business as you're implementing it. So one of those bits would be exactly to your point, like, how do we actually want to communicate to the customer? Do we want to embrace some of these really helpful frameworks like TCF or GPP, or overall, how do we want to also, how deep we want to go in terms of differentiating the visage for the tool to different users based on geolocation or what have you. So one of these bits is facilitating the conversation internally, which might be underestimated, but you really can't get far without having the right stakeholders, like the privacy and the marketers in the room making decisions together. Now, the key important bit for us in terms of making sure that the user experience is valued is in bringing together the important information on like practicalities of how the CMP banner should look like. So we have a lot of templates just to get the business started, to make it very easy and kind of intuitive to get the right visuals out. But also we're trying to make sure that we inject these templates with the regulatory guidance and the standard requirements. So we want to make sure that we're there making it much easier for the businesses to, embrace the TCF in the right form. Also, where they're, for instance, looking at complying with CCPA or GDPR, again, we're trying to give them like some sort of template, something to start with that is user-friendly, but still respects the regulatory requirements. So I think we're just trying to make sure that we bring all of the standards and the requirements into something practical and versatile for the users, that they can kind of take it and run with it or tweak it around, but kind of bringing it into the operational for them. Hopefully that answers the question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it does, absolutely. It's always like, and we were talking about this at the recent Tech Lab event in London with you and your team, Tony, right? The work that's been done to kind of simplify the language that is presented as by default by CMPs to users, to make sure it's understandable, and we can get into this value exchange, which it's critical for publishers, because publishers' kind of business model is advertising, and so they have to have that conversation. I'm curious though about brands. I've heard a lot of brands, wondering if it was even worth the effort, because they're not in the business of advertising, and so like that old discussion. What's your point on this? How is that embraced by brands, Arielle? What do you think of the how the brands are engaging with their consumer? Is this part of the engagement, or is it seen as a distraction, as an annoyance?
Yeah, I mean, I think the unfortunate reality is that for the vast majority of brands, that partnership between privacy and marketing is not as ironclad as it could be. So where there is that close partnership, that is where you see more thoughtful experience design with respect to privacy and preference management. That's also where you see the brands that are well positioned to differentiate on the way that they're enabling that. For the vast majority, though, it is this just disruptive, experience that is very unlike the amount of thought that they've put into the rest of the way that they showcase their brand to their customers. So there's certainly that kind of dissonance for a majority of brands still today. I do think, part of the challenge is, these solutions like the global privacy platform and the CMPs that integrate with it, they're much needed and helpful. But for marketers that aren't necessarily living and breathing the privacy dialogue and evolution day in and day out, it almost runs the risk of perpetuating this belief that it's handled, right? And so they truly need or benefit from their partners that are in this space surfacing these discussions. I know, Linda, you were mentioning how you use kind of the CMP implementation process to facilitate these conversations. That's exactly right, because I feel like in true kind of industry fashion, we've done a lot of work around technical standards for orchestrating preferences and conveying preferences so that we can mitigate disruption to data collection and use. And yet the core issue here around creating a fair value exchange for people and making them feel like they understand and have control over the way that their data is used seems to be a bit of an afterthought. And I do think that that's something that is relevant for brands and the broader ecosystem, particularly when we think about even, CPRA has some prescriptive language about secondary use that I'm not quite sure the industry has digested fully yet, right? So I think that the better that we can all get at creating and communicating the value exchange and giving people meaningful choice, the more poised we are to achieve true durability.
Yeah, and I think Arielle, if I can just jump in, Arielle, I think you keyed in on something really important here. Like with other challenges we face in an industry like viewability, like a lot of that was solved downstream by the industry, and the brands frankly didn't have to do much except demand some form of standard, and that's fine. When it comes to privacy, like this isn't just going to be solved downstream by ad tech and publishers and CMP partners. Like, any brand, if you're watching right now, like you will be held accountable by a government regulator if you are not compliant with the law. I mean, Sephora was a public case. I'm not speaking out of school here. Like that was a canary in the coal mine. So I think brands need to pay very close attention to this. And I think they need to be more on top of data security and privacy than really anything else in their advertising supply chain right now.
And you would also think that they are best positioned to have that discussion because like it for all of the technical implementation that the ad tech industry can make, they don't own the relationship with the customer, right? The user is either visiting a website because they like that website and they want to check the news or the sports scores or whatever, and so they have a relationship with the publisher, or they have a relationship with the brand. They don't have a relationship with the middleman, and so it's really important that the players at the edges who own the relationship, who have the brand relationship, the brand kind of trust from the user, kind of own that discussion, right?
Yeah, I mean, the one last thing I'd add here is part of the issue is because everyone also wants brands to feel comfortable with their solutions, whether that's, agencies or ad tech partners, there's a lot that gets thrown out there about like privacy compliant and privacy safe. And I understand the distinction between one's product being vetted and having standards in place and so on and so forth. But the reality is that doesn't absolve the responsibility of the marketers using the product. That gets lost. I'm sure that it's not unintentional that gets lost in some cases. I think everyone wants the people with the money to feel comfortable, but sometimes we do end up collectively shooting ourselves in the foot when we're not having those discussions early on, because at the end of the day, like I've had, clients that had not recognized that they would need a CMP or an opt-out solution, where had their partners raised that earlier, they could have kind of avoided a ton of last minute scramble and disruption, right? And the trade-off in not surfacing or making sure that you're kind of going above and beyond to provide that education is what a minor percentage of drop off because of an opt out. If we're in the US, it just doesn't make sense, right? So I think we could all kind of be a little bit better at being clearer around whose responsibility is what with respect to privacy.
I love that so much. I just need to jump in and just echo exactly your point, Arielle, because as much as we're trying to like make with the CMP tool and the templates the lives easier for the customers, I feel like sometimes the distinction of data processor, which is our CMP role, and the data control gets lost in translation, and they feel like by virtue of purchasing a CMP solution and not properly implementing it, their job is done, which is the exact opposite as you're saying. They're literally just shooting themselves in the foot by not doing the implementation properly. So yeah, love your points. Just want to echo, very much in agreement.
Lisa, anything you want to add to that? I mean, you're talking to, probably most of the ad tech players in the space about this, and do you relate to this kind of ownership versus shared responsibility to handle privacy matters?
Yes, I would agree with what my the panelists have said here. I think especially Arielle had said, and I would echo this, for too long we've kind of taken the approach of trying to minimize the opt-outs, right? Or the impact of that. And I think while it can be a business concern, I think what you risk by not being transparent and putting it all out there and giving the individual the ability to make the decision is that you then don't gain their trust. So I think that's the trade-off. And what we've seen some good examples of folks that are being very transparent. And and again, we would always say too, there's the requirements based on privacy regulation, and in some cases that's the minimum when you're talking about how you engage with your consumers and how you're communicating with them. I think then there's above and beyond, like, how do you want that experience to be for them? How are you going to instill that trust and provide transparency? And then, what does that process look like? There's many cases, we've seen examples where, there's multiple cookie banners that pop up on a website. And so, one pops up, you accept it, and then another one pops up, because to the earlier point, there's multiple different teams making these decisions in a silo, and no one realized that privacy team implemented one and marketing team implemented one, right? So I think there's instances like that. There's implementations where a cookie preference notice pops up, making it look like you have a choice, but there's nothing you can actually turn off. So again, that I think that just goes back to the user experience. And obviously we're much more in it than, a lot of people would be, but what message does that send if you're an individual and you're engaging with a partner or a brand and you're having that experience and not seeing the transparency and understanding how your data is being used and collected?
Still a lot of work to do. We're almost at time, so I just wanted to get your collective insights or ideas into what should we focus on as we get into 2024. What would be your top advice to publishers, to brands, to technology companies when it comes to embracing privacy and data protection in their processes? Who wants to get started? Wants to give it a first shot? Arielle?
Yeah,
you're unmuting first.
Yeah, I can start. I would say, and this really applies to everyone, but I'll focus on brands. I would make this year, especially as we get really close to third-party cookie deprecation and first-party data becomes increasingly important, I would really focus on a first-party data strategy that puts the person at the core, right? So think about, again, how are you going to deliver value and build experiences that the byproduct of which is information that allows you to enhance those experiences further and get away from thinking in terms of workarounds and mitigating disruption, right? So this really truly needs to be the year of creating a fair value exchange with customers, and at the core of that has to be respect for their preferences. And so it's important to also get your ducks in a row in terms of like an infrastructure standpoint and having a CMP that is set up to facilitate all of that.
Okay. Lisa?
So I would say for brands, I think it is, the point I recently made about transparency. So think about how you're engaging with your consumers. I think also asking the questions of your partners and trying to get a better understanding of what do they have in place? How are they handling privacy? Having those tough conversations and not just going based on, contractual agreements or what they said they were going to do, like making sure you're doing those checkups, especially as privacy regulation evolves. I think on the publisher and data provider platform side of things, it is trying to get ahead of the evolving regulation and finding a framework that helps you act more nimble and adjust as those regulations evolve and change and more regulation comes out, and let everyone, regardless where they live, opt out or exercise their subject access rights. I think that's just good business practice to let people have that
stable take in 2024. Linda, what would you say?
I would maybe focus on the internal governance piece, because I feel like that's tripping us up collectively a lot if that isn't in place. So especially I think for the brands, but probably every organization would benefit, given the situation we have with so many changes, pivot towards first party data. We need to be very solid on the marketing side, the business side, the privacy side, working very clearly together and making sure that we have those regular check-ins and almost like health checks, to Lisa's point and Arielle's, in making sure we're complying with everything we need to and making sure we're following the North Star or facilitating this good user experience and building trust.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Tony, last word.
Yeah, I agree with everything my fellow panelists have said. I would say be aggressive in testing new things. So first-party data is great. Not everyone has first-party data at scale. There are other ID-less solutions. There are ID resolution services out there, such as ID5. There's clean room solutions out there. There's various forms of privacy-enhancing technologies you can use to de-identify and anonymize consumers. Test cohort and lookalike modelings off of a good seed data set, right? I think if you're not aggressively testing these alternatives to future cookie deprecation and new privacy regulations to ensure you are compliant, but also are maintaining some form of redressable solution, whether you're a publisher or whether you're a brand or whether you're an ad tech company, you need to be aggressively testing. I think 2024 should be the year of privacy R&D. I would argue if you're only just starting in 2024, you're a little behind the 8 ball. But I think you need to aggressively invest in alternative solutions. And I think Linda really hit the nail on the head too. If you don't have a proper data governance strategy in house, or something that's drafted and framed up, you need to start there. Everything starts with your data governance policy, and then everything works downstream from there. So my advice to the industry is test aggressively.
Yeah, it can't be a second thought anymore. It can't be a side topic that a separate department out there talks about and handles for the rest of us. It's got to be kind of front and center in product design, in kind of go-to-market strategies, in consumer relationship. I like the fact. I hope it's going to be a real year and not like the year of mobile that kind of lasted about a decade. But yeah, the year of testing, the year of privacy R&D. I'm definitely seeing that from our standpoint as well. So we'll leave our listeners with that advice. Thank you very much, everyone, for your participation and your insights. It was really engaging discussions. I hope you enjoyed it as well. And stay tuned for the rest of the program. Thank you very much.